The entire kingdom was in chaos before the sun had finished rising. Every gate in the capital had been sealed, every patrol doubled. Riders had been dispatched to the 4 border provinces before the dawn mist had burned off the river, and the palace corridors echoed with the boots of guards who had been dragged from their beds by an order that brooked no questions and no delay. Find her. That was all the order said. 2 words, delivered in a voice that made grown men flinch. Alpha King Emmerich Valcourt stood at the center of the great hall, with his war council assembled around him, and he looked like a man coming apart at the seams. His hands were clenched at his sides. His jaw was locked so tight the tendons in his neck stood out like cords. And his eyes, those cold slate gray eyes that had stared down warlords and never blinked, were wild. Caius, his beta and the only man alive who could speak to him without invitation, stood 3 paces to his left and watched the king with an expression that hovered between alarm and something quieter. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. The thing no one in the room understood. The thing that made this morning feel like the world had tilted on its axis, was that all of this was for the scribe, the quiet woman who sat in the corner of every council meeting, the one who recorded every word, every decree, every diplomatic correspondence in a hand so precise it looked like calligraphy, the one who arrived early and left late, and never once raised her voice above the volume required to ask whether anyone needed the minutes from the previous session. Leora Voss. She had been part of the palace for 3 years. Part of the furniture, some might have said, though never within the king's hearing, because now he was standing in the great hall with his chest heaving and his wolf pressing so hard against his skin that his eyes kept flickering between gray and gold, and he was issuing commands that sounded less like royal orders and more like the desperate calculations of a man who had just realized he could not breathe. Her quarters were empty. Her belongings were gone. The small room beside the records chamber where she had lived and worked for 3 years had been stripped clean, the bed made with military precision, the shelves bare, the window left open as if to let the last trace of her scent dissolve into the night air. The only thing she had left behind was the ledger. It sat on her desk, closed and centered, the leather cover worn smooth from years of daily use. Caius had been the one to find it. He had opened it to the final page, expecting the minutes from yesterday's council session. Instead, he found a single line written beneath the last entry. Not council business, not a record of proceedings. Just 7 words in her careful, steady hand. I hope he sleeps well without me. Caius had read it twice. Then he had closed the ledger and gone directly to the king. That had been 40 minutes ago. Emmerich had not slept. That much was obvious to anyone who looked at him. The bruised hollows beneath his eyes were darker than usual. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his movements had a brittle, fractured quality, like a man forcing his body through motions while something inside him was screaming. But there was something else, something the council could see but could not name. The king kept pressing his fingers to his temples. His jaw would clench mid-sentence and he would stop speaking, his eyes going distant, unfocused, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. Twice he had gripped the edge of the table hard enough to leave marks in the wood. Whatever was happening to him, it was getting worse. Find her, he said again, and his voice cracked on the second word. No one moved fast enough. No one could. 12 hours earlier, Leora Voss had still been invisible. The thing about loving someone in silence is that you become very good at watching. Leora had been watching Emmerich Valcourt for 3 years, 2 months, and a handful of days she had stopped counting because counting made it worse. She knew the way he entered a room, always left shoulder first, as if bracing for a fight even when the only enemy was a stack of trade agreements. She knew the exact shade his eyes turned when he was angry, which was a darker gray, like wet stone, versus the shade they turned when he was thinking, which was lighter, almost silver at the edges. She knew he rubbed his right temple when the headaches came. She knew the headaches came often. She knew he never mentioned them to anyone, and that his jaw would lock, and his breathing would shallow, and he would push through whatever meeting or audience or inspection he was conducting, as if sheer willpower could substitute for whatever was breaking inside him. She knew all of this because it was her job to sit in the room and write down what happened, and no one paid attention to the scribe. Leora had come to the palace at 19, a war orphan from the eastern provinces with no family name worth claiming and no connections worth leveraging. She had exactly two things to recommend her: penmanship that her tutors at the foundling school had called extraordinary, and a stillness about her that made people forget she was in the room. That second quality had gotten her the position. The royal scribe needed to be present without being noticed. A piece of the architecture, wallpaper with a pulse. She had been good at it. Too good, perhaps. 3 years of sitting 5 paces from the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, recording his words, learning his patterns, memorizing the cadence of his voice, without ever being addressed directly. 3 years of watching him carry a weight that no one else seemed to see. A weight that lived behind his eyes and surfaced in those terrible headaches that bent him over his desk when he thought he was alone. She had fallen in love with him on a Tuesday. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no rescue, no grand gesture, no storm-swept battlefield confession. He had been reviewing Border Patrol reports late one evening, long after the council had left, and she had stayed to finish transcribing the session's notes. She was the only other person in the room, and he had forgotten she was there. His hand had gone to his temple, the headache again. And she had watched his face contort with a pain so raw and private that it made her chest ache in sympathy. Then he had exhaled slowly, opened his eyes, and gone back to work. That was it. That was the moment. Not his strength, but his refusal to stop despite the pain. The quiet, stubborn, relentless way he carried everything alone. She had loved him ever since with the particular hopelessness of someone who understood exactly how impossible it was. She was a foundling scribe. He was the Alpha King. The distance between them could not be measured in paces or rank. It was a different kind of distance entirely, the kind built into the bones of the world. So she had done what she always did. She watched, and she wrote, and she stayed invisible. The trouble started on the morning of the autumn equinox, when High Counselor Brennick brought up the matter of succession. The council had been dancing around it for months, the careful, circling approach of men who knew they were walking toward a fight they could not win. The king needed a mate. The kingdom needed an heir. The border provinces were restless, the southern pacts were testing boundaries, and the throne required the stability that only a bonded pair could project. Emmerich had deflected every previous attempt to raise the subject, but Brennick was old and stubborn and had served 3 kings before this one, and he was not easily deflected. "Your Majesty," the counselor began, and Leora could hear the carefully rehearsed diplomacy in every syllable. "The houses of the Western Reach have expressed interest in a formal alliance. Lady Odette Marchand, eldest daughter of Lord Marchand, has been proposed as a suitable match." Leora's pen did not falter. Her hand moved steadily across the page, recording the words with the same precision she brought to every session. But something behind her ribs went very still. She had known this was coming. She had transcribed the preliminary correspondence herself, the letters from Lord Marchand's people, the council's internal discussions when they thought the matter was still theoretical. She had written it all down in her steady hand and felt the ground shift beneath her with every word. Emmerich was quiet for a long time. Leora risked a glance upward and found him staring at the table, his expression unreadable. His fingers were pressed to his right temple again. The alliance would strengthen the western border, Brennick continued. The Marchand Pact controls 3 mountain passes. A mating bond between your houses would secure those passes permanently. More silence. The council shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Caius, standing behind the king's chair, caught Leora's eye for a brief, unreadable moment before looking away. "Arrange a meeting," Emmerich said finally. His voice was flat, empty. The voice of a man agreeing to something because every other option had been exhausted. Leora wrote the words down and did not let her hand shake. Lady Odette Marchand arrived at the palace 6 days later. She was tall and golden-haired and moved through the corridors with the fluid confidence of a woman who had been raised to occupy exactly this kind of space. She was gracious. She was intelligent. She was, by every measurable standard, perfect. Leora watched from her usual position in the corner of the council chamber as Emmerich received her. Watched the way Odette's hand rested on his arm during the formal introduction. Watched the careful, performative smile he offered in return, a smile that never reached his eyes but was convincing enough for everyone who did not know the difference. Leora knew the difference. She had been studying his face for 3 years. She knew every version of his smile and what each one meant, and this one meant nothing. It was currency spent for diplomacy. But it did not matter what the smile meant. What mattered was the decree. 2 weeks after Lady Odette's arrival, the king called a formal session and announced his intention to pursue the betrothal. Leora's pen stopped. It was the first time in 3 years that her hand had failed her. A single droplet of ink pooled at the tip of the nib and fell onto the page, a small dark bloom that spread across the parchment like a bruise. She stared at it. Then she dipped her pen and kept writing. The council erupted into murmurs of approval. Brennick looked quietly triumphant. Caius stood motionless behind the king's chair, his expression revealing nothing. And Leora wrote the betrothal decree in full. Every clause, every diplomatic flourish, every carefully chosen word that would bind the Alpha King to another woman. She wrote it all down, and when she was finished, she set her pen in its holder and closed the ledger and sat perfectly still while the room celebrated around her. No one looked at her. No one ever did. The feast that evening was magnificent. The great hall blazed with candlelight, the long tables groaning under silver platters and crystal decanters. Music drifted from the gallery above, and the court glittered in their finest attire, toasting the future queen with raised glasses and practiced smiles. Leora sat at the far end of the hall where the scribes and minor functionaries were placed, close enough to observe, but far enough to be forgotten. She wore her usual gray dress, the one that blended with the stone walls, and she held a cup of wine she had not touched. She watched Emmerich at the high table. Lady Odette sat beside him, her golden hair catching the candlelight, her laugh carrying across the hall with effortless charm. She leaned toward him to say something, and her fingers brushed his wrist. Leora looked away. The food tasted like nothing. The music sounded like it was coming from very far away. She sat through the toasts and the speeches and the counselors' self-congratulatory remarks about Western alliances and mountain passes, and she smiled when someone glanced in her direction because that was what you did when you were wallpaper. You reflected whatever the room expected and kept the rest locked behind your teeth. Midway through the evening, she made the mistake of looking up again. Emmerich was scanning the hall, his gaze moving across the crowd with the distant, cataloging attention of a man who was always assessing threats even at his own celebration. His eyes swept past the lower tables, past the servants, past the scribes, past her. His gaze moved through the space she occupied as if she were made of glass, as if she were not there at all. Something inside Leora cracked. It was not dramatic. There was no sound, no gasp, no outward sign. But she felt it happen. A small, clean break somewhere deep in her chest, like a bone that had been holding too much weight for too long and had finally, quietly, given way. She set down her untouched wine and left the feast. No one noticed. Back in her quarters, Leora sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees. The room was small and spare, as it had always been. A desk, a chair, a shelf of reference texts, a window that overlooked the inner courtyard. 3 years of her life contained in a space barely larger than a closet. She had always told herself that proximity was enough, that being near him, hearing his voice, existing in the same room as he did, was a form of having. A quiet, private, sustainable form that asked nothing of him and cost nothing she could not afford. She had been wrong. Proximity was not having. Proximity was starving with your face pressed against the glass of a bakery window, and she had been doing it for 3 years, and she could not do it for one more day. Leora stood up and began to pack. She did it methodically, the way she did everything. She folded her spare dress and her night clothes and placed them in the canvas bag she had brought with her from the foundling school. She wrapped her mother's ring, the only thing she had from before, in a cloth and tucked it into the inner pocket. She gathered her personal papers, her identification documents, the letter of employment she would no longer need. She left the reference texts. They belonged to the palace. When the bag was packed, she opened her ledger one final time. The betrothal decree stared up at her from the page, each word in her own handwriting, each letter a small act of self-destruction she had committed with perfect penmanship. Beneath the last line of official record, she dipped her pen and wrote 7 words. "I hope he sleeps well without me." She stared at the sentence. It said everything and nothing. It was petty and honest and sad, and she did not care. She closed the ledger, centered it on the desk, and left the room. The palace corridors were empty at this hour. The feast would continue for another 2 hours at least, and the guards posted at the inner gates were watching the celebration, not the service passages that connected the kitchens to the outer grounds. Leora had spent 3 years recording the palace's operations in exhaustive detail. She knew every shift rotation, every patrol gap, every door that was left unlocked between the second and third watch. She had written it all down at some point or another. She had never imagined she would use that knowledge to leave. The night air hit her face as she stepped through the postern gate, and she inhaled sharply, the cold burning her lungs. The capital spread out below the palace hill, a sprawl of tiled roofs and lamplight and sleeping streets. Beyond it, the eastern road stretched toward the provinces, toward the foundling school, toward a life that had no king in it. Leora pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her bag, and began to walk. She did not look back. Looking back was a luxury for people who had something to return to. The tears came about a mile past the outer wall. She let them fall without wiping them away, her boots steady on the packed earth road, her breath fogging in the autumn air. She cried quietly, the way she did everything quietly, and the road absorbed the sound as if it understood that some grief was meant to be private. Behind her, the palace glowed on its hill like a lantern. She kept walking. She was 2 miles from the capital when it happened. In his chambers, 3 floors above the empty records room, Emmerich Valcourt woke with a gasp. He had not been asleep long. An hour, perhaps less. The feast had drained whatever reserves he had left, and he had collapsed onto his bed still half-dressed, too exhausted to remove his boots. But now he was upright, his hands gripping the sheets, his heart slamming against his ribs, and something was very, very wrong. The noise. It hit him like a wall of water. A roaring, churning flood of sensation that poured into his skull from every direction at once. Anger from the guards on the night shift. Longing from a couple somewhere in the East Wing. Grief from a servant mourning a dead relative. Fear, boredom, jealousy, loneliness, every emotion in the palace crashing into him simultaneously, layered and tangled and impossibly loud. He pressed his palms against his temples and bit back a scream. It had not been this bad in years, not since before, not since. He froze. Something was missing. Not a sound, but the absence of sound. A pocket of quiet that he had grown so accustomed to that he had stopped noticing it existed. A stillness that had lived somewhere in the palace like a heartbeat he had mistaken for his own. It was gone. Emmerich stumbled to his feet, his vision blurring at the edges, the noise crashing through him in relentless waves. He braced himself against the bedpost and tried to think through the storm. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of the palace, and whatever thin barrier had been standing between him and the full force of his curse had just been ripped away. He made it to the door before his knees buckled. He caught himself on the frame and snarled through clenched teeth, forcing his body upright through sheer will. Then Caius was there, appearing from the shadows of the corridor like he always did when things went wrong, his face tight with concern. The scribe, Emmerich managed, the words barely coherent through the pain. Where is the scribe? Caius stared at him. Something flickered across the beta's face, a flash of understanding so swift it was almost invisible. I will find out, Caius said. He returned 9 minutes later with the ledger in his hands and a look on his face that Emmerich had never seen before. It might have been pity. It might have been vindication. It was hard to tell with Caius. She is gone, the beta said quietly. Her quarters are empty. She left this. He opened the ledger to the last page. Emmerich read the 7 words. Then he read them again. The noise inside his skull reached a pitch that made his vision go white at the edges. He gripped the ledger so hard the binding cracked. Wake the guard, he said, and his voice was something that did not sound human. Every patrol, every rider, every scout. Seal the gates. He looked up, and his eyes were no longer gray. They were gold, pure and blazing, his wolf surging forward with a fury that made the air in the corridor feel thin. Find her. By mid-morning, the search had taken on the character of a military campaign. Riders had been dispatched along every major road leaving the capital. Scouts were checking coaching inns and way stations. A full description had been circulated to the border garrisons, and Caius had personally interrogated the night watch to establish which gate she might have used. Emmerich stood over the map table in the war room and directed all of it with the focused precision of a man planning a siege. His voice was steady. His orders were clear. And every 30 seconds, he pressed his fingers to his temple and closed his eyes against a pain that was eating him alive. The noise had not stopped. It had gotten worse. Every person who entered the war room brought their emotions with them like a draft through an open door. The guards carried anxiety and confusion. Brennick radiated irritation and political calculation. A servant passing in the corridor carried a thread of grief about something Emmerich could not identify and did not want to feel, but felt anyway. Sharp and sudden and nauseating. He was drowning. The palace was a roaring ocean of other people's feelings, and the thin wall of silence that had kept him above water for 3 years had vanished in the night. Caius waited until the room was empty, then closed the door. You sealed the gates for a scribe, Your Majesty, the beta said, his voice carefully neutral. Emmerich did not look up from the map. She has access to classified military correspondence, 3 years of council minutes, border patrol schedules, diplomatic intelligence. If she reaches the wrong hands, the security implications are significant. The words sounded practiced. They sounded like something he had been rehearsing in his head for the past hour, polishing the excuse until it gleamed with plausibility. Caius was quiet for a moment. You never spoke her name, he observed. Not once in 3 years. I checked the household records to confirm, and you have never once addressed her directly. She sat 5 paces from your chair at every council session, and you never looked at her. Emmerich's jaw tightened. Your point? My point, Caius continued, is that you did not know her name until I told you this morning, and now you have the entire kingdom searching for her. The king said nothing. His fingers pressed harder against his temple. Caius moved to the table and placed his hands flat on the map, forcing Emmerich to meet his eyes. "The headaches," he said, lowering his voice. "They were always better during council sessions, weren't they?" The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to have weight. Emmerich's hand dropped from his temple. He stared at Caius with an expression that shifted from denial to confusion to something colder. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding. "I never connected it," he said slowly. "No," Caius agreed. "You wouldn't have. She was invisible. That was the entire point of her position. But I've been tracking your episodes for 2 years, and the pattern is there." The headaches diminished when she was in proximity. They worsened during her days off. They disappeared almost entirely during extended council sessions when she sat beside you for hours. Emmerich braced his hands against the table edge. The wood creaked under his grip. "That is not possible," he said. "The curse cannot be suppressed by proximity to a single person. Mirren and her healers have tried everything." "Have they tried her?" Caius asked. Another silence. Longer this time. Before Emmerich could respond, the door opened, and Mirren herself entered, her sharp eyes sweeping the room with the practiced assessment of a woman who had been treating the king's secret condition for years. "Sit down," she said in the tone that brooked no argument. "Caius sent for me, and I can see from across the room that you are in crisis." Emmerich did not sit. Mirren examined him anyway, standing on her toes to press her fingers to his temples, tilting his head to study his eyes, checking his pulse with practiced efficiency. "The curse is fully active," she announced. "No suppression at all." "When did this start?" "Last night," Emmerich ground out. "Shortly after midnight." Mirren turned to Caius. "The scribe left around that time?" Caius nodded. Mirren's expression shifted. Something passed behind her eyes, a rapid calculation that rearranged everything she thought she knew. "Sit down," she said again, and this time the command carried a weight that made even the king obey. He sank into a chair. "This is not just the curse," Mirren said carefully. "What I'm seeing is compounded by something else. Something biological. Your wolf is in distress. Your vitals are erratic, and the empathic flooding has intensified beyond anything the curse alone should produce." She paused, choosing her next words with the precision of a surgeon choosing where to cut. "Your Majesty, you are experiencing bond severance. An incomplete mating bond has been forming between you and that woman, likely for years. Her proximity sustained it, kept it quiet, kept you quiet. Now that she is gone, the bond is tearing, and it is taking your defenses against the curse down with it." Emmerich stared at her. "She is your mate," Mirren said plainly. "And if the bond is not restored, you will both deteriorate." The word landed like a blade. "Both?" Emmerich's voice was barely audible. "She is suffering this too?" Mirren's expression softened fractionally. "If the bond is as developed as I believe, then yes, she will be experiencing the same severance. Pain, disorientation, physical decline. She may not understand what is happening to her, but it is happening." Emmerich stood so abruptly the chair toppled behind him. His eyes flashed gold, and for a moment the room seemed to vibrate with the force of his wolf pressing against the surface. "Then I need to find her now," he said. The complication arrived in silk and composure. Lady Odette Marchand appeared in the doorway of the war room not 10 minutes after Mirren's revelation, drawn by the commotion that had turned the palace upside down since dawn. She took in the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes, the toppled chair, the king's ashen face, the healer and the beta exchanging loaded glances. "Someone want to tell me why the entire garrison is searching for a scribe?" she asked, her voice pleasant but edged with something harder beneath the courtesy. Emmerich froze. The sight of her, his betrothed, standing in the doorway while the word mate still echoed in his skull, produced a collision of guilt and obligation so severe it nearly drove him to his knees. Or perhaps that was the curse. It was getting harder to separate his own emotions from the flood pouring in from everyone around him. Caius stepped forward smoothly. "A security matter, my lady. Nothing that requires your concern." Odette looked at Caius, then at Emmerich, and the expression on her face made it clear she was not fooled. She was Lord Marchand's daughter, raised in a political household, trained to read rooms the way generals read battlefields. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I am to be queen of this kingdom," she said calmly. "If the king is unwell, I should know. If there is a security breach, I should know. And if this is something else entirely—" She paused, her gaze settling on Emmerich with an unsettling clarity. "Then I should especially know." The silence that followed was excruciating. Emmerich looked at her. This woman he had agreed to bond with for the sake of mountain passes and border security, and felt the full weight of what he was about to do. She had done nothing wrong. She had come to the capital in good faith. She was gracious and capable, and would make an excellent queen, and she was not his mate. "My lady," he began, his voice rough. Odette held up a hand. "I would prefer honesty over diplomacy, Your Majesty. We can skip the preamble." Emmerich exhaled. "There is someone," he said. "I did not know until she was gone. I did not know at all." Odette studied him for a long moment. Her composure held, but something shifted in her eyes. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. "The scribe," she said. "The quiet one who sat in the corner." Emmerich blinked. "You noticed her?" Odette's smile was thin and sad. "I noticed that you didn't notice her." Which is its own kind of noticing. A woman who sits 5 paces from a king for 3 years and never once draws his eye is either remarkably forgettable or remarkably disciplined. She was clearly the latter. The observation landed with a precision that made Emmerich's chest ache. Odette straightened, smoothing the front of her dress with a gesture that was pure reflex, a woman reassembling herself in real time. "Go," she said. "Find her. We can discuss the political implications when you return, but if what I suspect is true, then there is no betrothal to discuss. A mate bond supersedes any contract." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it is worth, Your Majesty," she added quietly, "I hope she is worth the chaos." She left. The door clicked shut behind her. Caius exhaled slowly. Well, that was handled better than expected. Emmerich was already moving, crossing to the weapons rack and pulling down his riding cloak. "We leave now." "Your Majesty," Brennick interrupted from the corridor where he had clearly been listening. "The Council will not support this. An Alpha King does not abandon his court to chase a common scribe across the countryside. The optics alone would be devastating." "She is not just a scribe," Emmerich said. It was the first time he had said it aloud, and the words seemed to change the air pressure in the room. Brennick opened his mouth to argue, saw the gold bleeding into the king's eyes, and wisely chose silence. Within the hour, 3 riders cleared the eastern gate at a gallop. Emmerich, Caius, and a tracker named Hale, who had served the crown since before Emmerich took the throne. They carried minimal provisions and moved fast, following the route the night scouts had identified. A merchant had seen her. A woman traveling alone on the eastern road, dark-haired, carrying a canvas bag, moving with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She had passed through the village of Ashgrove some time before dawn and continued east without stopping. East, toward Thornfeld, toward the foundling school where she had grown up. Emmerich drove his horse harder. The curse worsened with every mile. Every hamlet they passed through, every farmstead, every cluster of lives along the road poured emotions into him like water through a broken dam. A farmer's frustration over a failed crop, a child's delight at chasing a dog, A widow's grief, old but bottomless, that hit Emmerich so hard he swayed in the saddle. Caius caught his arm and steadied him without a word. "The farther you ride from the palace, the worse this gets," the beta said, his voice low. "Every person you pass adds to the flood. You cannot sustain this." Emmerich's teeth were clenched so hard his jaw ached. He could feel his wolf thrashing beneath his skin, desperate and furious, and fixed on a single point to the east like a compass needle that could not be deflected. "I can sustain it long enough," he said. He closed his eyes and reached for the only thing that cut through the noise, not a sound, but a memory. The memory of silence. The memory of a council chamber where his headache had eased without explanation. The memory of sitting at a table with a quiet woman 5 paces to his right, her pen scratching softly across parchment, and the noise in his head going blessedly, inexplicably still. He had never looked at her. 3 years of peace she had given him, and he had never once turned his head to see where it was coming from. The shame of it burned worse than the curse. He opened his eyes and spurred his horse forward into the fading afternoon light. Leora reached Thornfeld as the sun was setting. The village was smaller than she remembered. The buildings huddled together like they were bracing against the wind, their thatched roofs dark with moss, their windows glowing faintly with lamplight. The Foundling School sat at the eastern edge, a long stone building with a courtyard that had once seemed enormous to a child and now looked barely large enough to turn a horse. She stood at the gate and felt nothing. Or rather, she felt too much to isolate any single emotion, and the result was a kind of numbness that sat in her chest like a stone. This was where she had been left. A bundle on the steps, they had told her, on a night cold enough to kill. The headmistress had found her before dawn, screaming her lungs out, furious at the world for abandoning her before she had even learned to open her eyes. Leora had spent her entire childhood trying to be quiet enough, useful enough, good enough, that no one would ever leave her again. And then she had spent 3 years doing exactly the same thing in a palace, for a man who did not know her name. The irony was not lost on her. It was just too heavy to laugh at. She found lodging at the village's only inn, a crooked building with low ceilings and a fireplace that smoked. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Galda, looked at her with the practiced concern of someone accustomed to travelers who arrived looking like the road had chewed them up. "You look unwell, dear," Galda observed, setting a bowl of broth in front of her. Leora managed a smile. Just tired. But she was more than tired. The hollowness in her chest had deepened throughout the day, a persistent ache that no amount of walking or distraction could ease. Her hands trembled when she lifted the spoon. Her vision kept blurring at the edges, soft and gray, as if the world were slowly losing focus. She thought it was grief. The physical cost of walking away from 3 years of silent love, of severing herself from the only life she had known since leaving this village. Heartbreak manifesting in the body. It happened. She had read about it. What she had not read about was the pull. It had started sometime around midday, a low, insistent tug behind her breastbone that seemed to point back the way she had come. Like a thread connected to something west of her, something vital, and every step she took eastward stretched it tighter. She ignored it. She was good at ignoring things that hurt. She had been practicing for years. But by evening, the pull had become a pressure, and the pressure had become a pain that radiated from her chest into her limbs and made her fingers clumsy and her thoughts slow. Galda brought a healer, an old woman named Cressida who smelled of dried sage and spoke in the blunt, unvarnished manner of country practitioners who had seen everything. Cressida pressed her fingers to Leora's wrist, studied her eyes, listened to her breathing. Then she sat back and frowned. "You are not ill," she said. "Not in any way I can treat. Something in you is reaching for something that is not here. Have you lost someone recently?" Leora stared at the ceiling. not someone I ever had. Cressida gave her a look that suggested she knew exactly how much Leora was leaving out but was too polite to press. Rest, the healer said. Eat. Whatever is happening, your body needs strength. Leora tried. She ate half the broth and drank some water and lay down on the narrow bed in her rented room. The sheets smelled of lye and old wool. The ceiling was low enough that she could have touched it if she raised her hand. She closed her eyes. The ache roared. It came in waves now, cresting and falling with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat, except it was not hers. It was somewhere else. Someone else. A distant percussion that resonated through whatever invisible thread still connected her to the west. She curled onto her side and pressed her fist against her sternum, trying to push the pain back down. I left, she told herself. I had to leave. There was nothing for me there. He does not know me. He was never going to know me. I wrote his words for 3 years and he never looked up. All true. All of it. Every word was accurate and none of it helped. Because the ache did not care about accuracy. It cared about proximity, about the absence of something it needed the way lungs needed air, and no amount of rational thought could convince it that the right decision and the survivable decision were the same thing. Hours passed. The fire in the hearth burned down to embers. The room grew cold. Leora's trembling worsened. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and felt the ache spread from her chest into her bones, into her blood, into every part of her. She thought about the last time she had been warm, sitting in the council chamber, 5 paces from the king, her pen moving steadily across the page while his voice filled the room. She had been warm then. She had always been warm in that room, in his proximity, wrapped in something she had mistaken for contentment, when it was actually something far more dangerous. The trembling became shaking. The shaking became convulsions. Leora tried to call out, but her voice came out as a whisper. The room tilted sideways, and the edges of her vision went dark, and she felt herself falling inward, collapsing like a building whose foundations had been quietly removed. The last thing she felt before consciousness left her was the thread in her chest going taut, vibrating like a struck wire, sending a single, desperate pulse westward into the dark. 40 miles away, on a road between 2 nameless villages, Emmerich Valcourt pulled his horse to a violent stop. Caius drew up beside him. What is it? Emmerich was rigid in the saddle, his eyes wide, his hand pressed flat against his chest. His face had gone white. Something is wrong, he said, and his voice shook for the first time since Caius had known him. Something is very wrong. She is... He could not finish the sentence. The bond, thin and incomplete and stretched across 40 miles of countryside, pulsed once more against his ribs and then went terrifyingly, absolutely, still. Emmerich roared her name into the dark. The sound tore through the night, raw and anguished and barely human, and it sent birds scattering from the trees in every direction. Caius steadied his own horse and watched the king spur his mount forward at a speed that bordered on reckless, plunging into the darkness of the eastern road, like a man being chased by something worse than death. The beta followed without hesitation. Behind them, Hale drove his horse to keep pace, and the 3 riders disappeared into the night, racing toward a woman who might already be beyond their reach. They reached Thornfeld before dawn. The village was dark and still, its windows shuttered against the autumn cold, and Emmerich was off his horse before the animal had fully stopped. The bond in his chest had gone from a vibration to a faint, barely perceptible hum, like a heartbeat heard from too far away, and the weakness of it terrified him more than anything the curse had ever done. Caius caught the reins of his horse and asked no questions. Hale was already knocking on the inn door. Galda, the innkeeper, appeared in her nightclothes with a candle in one hand and a look on her face that shifted rapidly from irritation to alarm when she saw 3 armed men and the wild-eyed expression of the one in front. The woman, Emmerich said. Dark hair? Traveling alone. Where is she? Galda led them upstairs without argument. She had seen enough of the world to know when a man was past the point of being reasoned with, and this one was past it by a considerable distance. The room was small and cold. The fire had burned to ash. And Leora was on the bed, curled tight on her side, her face drained of color, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. Emmerich crossed the room in 2 strides and dropped to his knees beside the bed. The moment his hand touched hers, something happened. A current, warm and immediate, passed between their skin. The hum in his chest flared brighter, steadied, and began to strengthen. He heard her inhale, a sharp, involuntary gasp, and her fingers twitched beneath his. The noise in his head, the relentless howling storm that had battered him for 2 days, dimmed, not gone, not silent, but pushed back, muffled as if someone had closed a window between him and the chaos. He exhaled so hard his entire body shuddered. Leora's eyes opened. For a moment she simply stared at him. Her gaze was glassy and unfocused, and he watched consciousness return in stages, confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to something he could not read. "Your Majesty?" she whispered. The title cut through him like a blade. He was kneeling on a rough wooden floor in a village inn, holding the hand of a woman he had ignored for 3 years, and she was calling him, "Your Majesty." "Emmerich," he said. "My name is Emmerich." She blinked at him. Her color was returning faintly, the gray pallor receding as the bond fed warmth back into her through their joined hands. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. He did not let go of her hand. "Where else would I be?" "Running your kingdom," she replied, "signing your betrothal, doing any of the things that do not involve chasing a scribe across the countryside." The words had an edge, thin and brittle, like a blade forged from hurt rather than steel. Emmerich heard the pain underneath and knew he deserved every syllable. "The betrothal is dissolved," he said. "Lady Odette released me herself." Leora's expression flickered. "Released you? Why?" "Because she saw what I was too blind to see," Emmerich said, and the rawness in his voice surprised even him. "Because she noticed you before I did, and she had the grace to step aside." Leora pulled her hand away. The noise surged back into his skull immediately, sharp and punishing, and he flinched but did not reach for her again. "You did not notice me," she said, sitting up slowly. Her movements were fragile, careful, like a woman testing whether her body would cooperate. "You never once looked at me. 3 years I sat in that room and wrote your words, and you never knew my name." "I know," Emmerich said. "I loved you," Leora continued, and now the edge in her voice was crumbling, revealing the wound beneath. "I loved you, and you looked through me like I was part of the furniture. Do you understand what that feels like? To be invisible to the one person you would give everything to be seen by?" Emmerich stared at her. The curse was screaming in his head, every emotion in the village pouring through him, but her words cut deeper than any of it. "No," he said. "I don't understand. Because I was the fool who had peace for 3 years and never once asked where it came from. I had silence in a world that has been nothing but noise since the curse took hold, and I never turned my head to see that the silence was you." He paused. His hands were shaking. "I cannot undo 3 years of blindness, Leora. I cannot earn back the time I wasted not knowing your name. But I am here, and I am asking you to let me see you now." The silence between them was immense. Leora's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her lips together and looked away, toward the window where the first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning to show. "I left because staying was killing me," she said quietly. "Loving someone who does not see you is a slow kind of death, and I had been dying for years." Emmerich moved closer. not reaching for her, just closer. "Then let me see you," he said again, "not because the bond demands it, not because the curse requires your proximity, because I was wrong, and I know I was wrong, and I would rather spend the rest of my life proving it than one more hour pretending I can survive without you." Leora looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had been looking at him for 3 years from her corner of the council chamber, except now he was looking back. "You are terrible at this," she said, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I know," Emmerich admitted. She reached for his hand. The bond flared the moment their fingers intertwined, bright and warm and so overwhelming that Leora gasped. The current ran through both of them, deeper now, stronger, settling into bone and blood with a permanence that felt like coming home. Emmerich leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers. His breath was unsteady. His eyes were closed. And when she tilted her face up and kissed him, he made a sound low in his throat that was equal parts relief and desperation, and 3 years of loneliness breaking open all at once. The kiss deepened. His hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and she could feel the trembling in his fingers, the barely contained force of a man who was terrified of holding too tight and incapable of letting go. When they finally pulled apart, his eyes were gold, bright and unwavering, and his wolf was so close to the surface she could feel it pressing against his skin where their bodies touched. He bit her. The mating bite, driven by instinct older than language, and the bond sealed itself with a force that stole the breath from both of them. She marked him in return, claiming him as hers, and felt the bond lock into place, complete and irreversible. The noise in his head went silent, not muffled, not pushed back. Silent. Emmerich's eyes went wide. The silence held for 10 seconds, 20, a full minute. Then, slowly, the noise crept back in, quieter than before, manageable, but still there. The curse was not broken. They stayed in the room at the inn through the morning and into the afternoon. Caius posted himself outside the door and turned away every interruption with a calm authority that suggested the beta had been waiting for this particular duty for a very long time. Leora lay with her head on Emmerich's chest and felt the bond humming between them, steady and warm and more real than anything she had ever experienced. She could feel him now, not just his presence, but his interior, the constant grinding vigilance, the weight he carried in his shoulders even when he slept, and beneath it all, like a wound that had never been cleaned, the curse. It was quieter with her beside him. She could feel the way her proximity dampened the empathic flood, absorbing the worst of it, creating a radius of calm around them both. But it was still there, pressing at the edges, waiting for any gap in their contact to rush back in. "It is not going to stop, is it?" she asked. Emmerich was quiet for a moment. His hand moved slowly through her hair, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "The curse was placed during the Ashenmoor campaign," he said. "A woman named Vel. Her settlement was caught between our forces and the enemy, and when the fighting was over, her people were among the dead." He paused. "She cursed me to feel every heart I had failed to protect, to carry their pain. All of it. Forever." Leora was silent, letting him speak. "The curse should have faded by now," Emmerich continued. "Mirren said it years ago. The magic was strong but not permanent. It should have weakened. Instead, it has gotten worse." He exhaled. "I have never understood why." Leora lay still, feeling the bond pulse between them. Through it, she could sense the shape of his pain, not the details but the texture. Guilt, enormous and unrelenting, wrapped around everything inside him like a vine strangling a tree. "Let me in," she said. Emmerich stiffened. "What? The bond? You are holding it half open. You are letting me feel the surface but not the depth." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Let me in all the way. Let me feel what you feel." His expression closed immediately. "No, the flood would overwhelm you. You do not know what it is like to feel hundreds of people at once." Leora held his gaze. "I have spent my entire life watching people, reading their faces, interpreting their moods, understanding their emotions from the outside because I was never important enough to be told directly." She paused. "You think I will drown?" "I won't." Emmerich shook his head. "You cannot know that. And you cannot heal if you keep carrying this alone," Leora replied. The stubbornness in her voice surprised them both. "You tried alone for years, and it nearly killed you. Let me help. Please." The silence that followed was thick with resistance. She could feel him fighting it through the bond, every instinct telling him to protect her, to keep the worst of himself locked away where it could not touch her. Then, slowly, she felt the wall come down. The flood hit her like a physical force. Emotions poured through the bond in a torrent, hundreds of voices, hundreds of feelings, anger and sorrow and joy and fear and boredom and love and grief, all layered on top of each other in a deafening, dizzying cascade. Leora gasped. Her fingers dug into his arm, and for a terrible moment she thought he had been right. It was too much. She was going to drown. But she held on. She held on the way she had held on to everything in her life, with quiet, relentless stubbornness, and slowly, incrementally, she began to sort through the noise. Not fighting it, not blocking it, just letting it pass through her the way water passes through open fingers. She could feel the farmer's frustration from the road, Galda's worry downstairs, Cressida's curiosity, Caius's fierce protectiveness outside the door. The emotions moved through her and kept moving, arriving and departing like waves, and she let them go. And then, beneath it all, she found what she was looking for: his guilt. It was not an emotion among many. It was the foundation. The bedrock on which the entire curse had built its house, a massive, immovable conviction that lived at the center of Emmerich Valcourt like a second heartbeat. The belief that he deserved this, that the people who died at Ashenmoor were his responsibility, his failure, his debt, and that no amount of suffering would be enough to repay it. The curse had not faded because he would not let it fade. He had been feeding it for years with his own guilt, keeping it alive, keeping it strong, because some part of him believed the punishment was just. "You think you deserve this?" Leora whispered. Emmerich went rigid beneath her. "You think their deaths are a debt you have not finished paying," she continued, her voice thick with tears. "So you carry the pain. You refuse to let it go because letting it go would feel like forgetting them. And you would rather destroy yourself than forget." His breathing had gone ragged. She could feel the truth of it reverberating through the bond, raw and exposed and undeniable. "I gave the order," he said, his voice barely audible. "The settlement was in the crossfire, and I gave the order to advance. I knew the risk. I calculated it. And I chose the mission over their lives." Leora sat up and took his face in her hands. "Yes," she said, and she did not flinch. "You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation, and people died. That is true. That happened. And it was terrible." She felt his jaw clench beneath her palms. "But carrying their pain forever does not bring them back," she continued. "It does not honor them. It just destroys you. And she paused, her voice breaking. "I spent my entire life believing I was not worth seeing, that if I had been better, my parents would have kept me, that I had to earn every scrap of love by being useful, by being invisible, by never asking for anything." She held his gaze. "We have both been telling ourselves lies, Emmerich. Yours is that you deserve to suffer. Mine is that I deserve to be invisible. And they are both wrong." His eyes filled with tears. She watched them fall and did not look away. "You are allowed to put this down," she whispered. "You are allowed to grieve and still live. You are allowed to be forgiven." Something broke inside him. Not the curse. Something older. Something that had been holding the curse in place for years, feeding it, sustaining it, keeping it rooted in his chest like a parasite that its host had chosen to shelter. The guilt did not vanish. It would not vanish overnight, and Leora knew that. But it loosened. She felt it through the bond, felt the terrible, crushing weight shift and ease, felt Emmerich take a full breath for what might have been the first time in years. And as the guilt loosened, so did the curse. The empathic flood receded, not completely, but significantly, pulling back like a tide going out, leaving behind a quiet that was not silence, but something close, something livable, something that felt like the beginning of peace. Emmerich pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. His shoulders shook. He buried his face in her hair and let the grief pour out of him, years of it, and Leora held him and did not let go. "I see you," he said into her hair, his voice ragged and raw. "I see you, Leora." She closed her eyes and let the tears come. The curse did not break cleanly. It faded in stages over the months that followed, loosening its grip as Emmerich slowly, painfully learned to lay down the guilt he had carried since Ashenmoor. Some days were harder than others. Some mornings he woke with the noise pressing in and his hands shaking, and Leora would take his hand and sit with him until it passed. She never told him it would be easy. She never pretended the pain was not real. She just stayed. The court's reaction to their mating was predictable. A foundling scribe as the Alpha Queen was not what the noble houses had envisioned, and the whispers followed Leora through the palace corridors like shadows she could not outrun. But Emmerich stood beside her at every public function, his hand on the small of her back, his gaze daring anyone to voice what they were whispering. They did not dare. Odette Marchand returned to the western provinces with a grace that earned her more admiration than any betrothal could have, and the alliance with the Marchand pack was eventually secured through a trade agreement that Leora herself helped draft. She was, after all, very good with documents. Brennick grumbled for exactly 3 weeks before conceding that the new queen's knowledge of policy, governance, and diplomatic correspondence was unmatched by anyone on the council, including himself. She had, after all, written it all down. Months later, Leora sat beside Emmerich in the council chamber, not in the corner but at the table, her ledger open in front of her, her pen in hand. Old habits. She still liked to record things. It helped her think. Emmerich was reviewing a border report. His brow was furrowed, his attention fixed on the document, and his left hand rested on her knee beneath the table. He did that now. Small, constant points of contact that he maintained without thinking about it, his hand on her shoulder as he passed. His fingers brushing her wrist during meetings, his forehead pressed against hers in the quiet moments before sleep. He was not cured. The empathic sensitivity remained, a faint echo of the curse that might never fully disappear. But it was manageable now, quieter, more like an extra sense than a prison, and on the days when it surged, Leora was there. She was always there. The old ledger sat on a shelf in their chambers, closed and untouched. Leora had considered throwing it away, but Emmerich had asked her to keep it. He said the 7 words on the last page were important. "A reminder," he told her once, pulling her close in the dark, "of what I almost lost because I did not look up." Leora had smiled against his chest and said nothing, because some things did not need words. Outside, the kingdom carried on in its imperfect, sprawling way. Wars threatened and were averted. Harvests came and went. The noble houses adapted, grudgingly, to a queen who had once been invisible and now refused to be. And in the council chamber, 5 paces from where she had once sat unnoticed. Leora Voss recorded the proceedings in her steady hand and felt the king's thumb trace a slow circle on her knee, a tiny, deliberate gesture that said more than any decree. I see you. I see you. I see you.